You're watching act.tv. I'm Julianna Forlano from the Minneapolis City Council, voting unanimously to replace their police department with community-led public safety. To school districts across the country ending their contracts with police departments, it's clear that the nationwide historic uprisings are making waves. But in order to fully address systemic racism in the US, we need to look at how it permeates all aspects of society, namely environmental racism. Steve Horn is with us now to talk about that. Steve, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Good to be back on.
I'm very happy that you're here. Steve is a San Diego-based climate reporter and producer for the Real News Network and a freelance investigative reporter. His work has appeared in the Intercept, The Guardian, Jazeera America, Vice, and everywhere that the good news is gotten, good independent news is gotten. So happy to have you here with us. Where do we start on this topic?
Well, I liked your, I'm glad that the intro that you did. I mean, like, maybe a good place to start is I'm in California. What's happening in California right now? Maybe that's it. We can go from there. Yeah. So California, on June 1st, 2 weeks ago, while thousands of people were in the streets across America and across California and in all of its biggest cities, San Diego included where I live, Los Angeles and the like. While that was happening, and while the governor was kind of giving voice to the concerns that people had about police shootings and unaccountability of that and this systemic racism that exists in our society and in our state, he, through one of his regulatory agencies, went ahead and gave 12 fracking permits to a company owned by an ExxonMobil / Shell Oil 50-50 joint venture company called Aera Energy, AERA Energy. So 12 fracking permits in a 97% Latino community, which is kind of the epicenter of fracking and drilling in California, in the Bakersfield area in Kern County. And it's a town called Lost Hills, and it was in the Lost Hills oil field. So I have a story coming out about that soon, but I think that we're going to see more and more of that going forward with, especially on the Democratic Party side, where there's lip service paid to certain things. They're trying to say certain things that, I'm woke and I'm here for the moment and I hear your concerns, but we're going to see the very underlying type of things that people are protesting, which is this systemic racism, right? So environmental racism fits within that. This sort of who feels the burdens more of drilling, or who feels the burden more of the impacts of climate change. It's often people of color. It's poor people, not just in the United States, but around the world. And this is just a perfect example of that. It's actually a perfect example of California's climate policy, and that drilling continues. It continues to impact disproportionately Latino communities, and they have a program called Cap and Trade, in which that is okay because under this, it's not actually okay, but under the way that the policy, quote unquote okay, because they're offsetting it with these, green programs, or these sort of through these accounting tricks, everything works out in the end, except for even that program is now up for question, which is not, this is a bigger story, is that because of the economic crisis with COVID, the crazy thing about the program is less drilling is going to be able to take place because these oil companies are distressed economically. Therefore, there'll be less, in a way. Yeah, the crazy thing is there'll be less revenue for the cap and trade program. Therefore, the good side of the cap and trade program, the quote unquote good side, won't be able to take place in the same way. Which means I think that in California is going to have to be a reimagining of the entirety of the paradigm. So that'd be interesting.
Let me get this straight from a layperson's point of view.
Sure.
They're destroying people's neighborhoods because, as I quoted you from your piece before you got here, the rates of asthma, I think you said upper respiratory, cancer, all of these different health issues that happen around the people, the people who are living around the extraction process happen. So they're saying, well, we can still extract and, I guess, to hell with the people around us because we're doing cap and trade. And so therefore it'll be cleaner, sort of, somewhere. We'll have to clean it up, right? But they're not really they're greenwashing themselves with cap and trade while they're still hurting the people around whom they're extracting.
That's the exact paradigm, and it's not just in the drilling field, it's also in like the refineries. If you go to like the Bay Area, in Richmond, California, for example, which is, you know, a predominantly Black and Latino and also Asian American community. So it's like working class people with, you know, the biggest refinery in California is owned by Chevron there. So it's like, it's not just the extraction, but it's also the refining, and there's a lot of, you know, tar sands oil that comes into that refinery that gets imported. So yeah, that's the program in a nutshell, right? They say that that stuff is okay, quote unquote, because we will be able to offset that through this accounting trick that we have called cap and trade, which, by the way, like, just to update it, like last year there were a whole bunch of stories that came up from ProPublica, and it's very much in question how much of a climate impact the actual cap and trade program. So the central argument of this is, of course, that's okay because it's making a climate dent. Even that is, I think, very much up for question right now. So we're kind of at that moment where I think the entire future of the cap and trade program is very much in question due to this economic crisis. So it's an opening, I would say, for people who are engaged in climate politics within California, and I would say nationally, because California has such a big state with so many people and such a big national footprint on all this stuff, that there's this whole expression of, quote unquote, as goes California, as goes the nation. So it's definitely something to watch out for, is the future of this cap and trade program right now, which is very much in crisis due to the economic situation.
Well, right before you came on, right before we actually went live on Twitch, we usually go, or excuse me, live on Facebook. We are live on Twitch before that. We were reading about, Australia's top climate scientists saying we are basically already deep into the trajectory toward the collapse of civilization because of climate. So, cap and trade seems like, rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. It's crazy. You recently wrote about frontline communities with respect to the Trump administration's rollback of environmental regulations. What are frontline communities? Let's just make sure we all know that. I think, so we're on the same page. And why is it important we pay attention to how the climate crisis is, affecting those communities?
It's a great question. First of all, I don't love the term frontline communities. It's just sort of this euphemism that the climate movement has used. I don't know if it's because they don't want to say it's poor people of color. I don't know if they just don't want to come out and say it so directly. So it's sort of this way of maybe nicely saying it, but that's who frontline communities mostly, not only, but mostly are. And I would say even, grander scheme is frontline communities usually means poor working class communities. So if you're looking at it from a class perspective, like North Dakota, might not be that many, although there will be quite a few native people, might not be as diverse of a community, but most of those people who are living by refineries or facilities that where the oil goes to be refined into something, those are working class people mostly, where their schools are located. And so that's a frontline communities, just kind of means who disproportionately feels the impacts of these extractive and refining processes. When you're talking about the fossil fuel industry, it could mean like industrial processes. So yeah, I would say it's, if you look across the United States, still disproportionately Black communities and people of color, Latino communities. If you're looking at the Houston area, it depends on where you go, but yeah, no matter where you go, it's generally disproportionately people of color who are feeling those impacts.
Have you noticed any shift in the protests that began as, justice for George Floyd, then moved into Black Lives Matter? Have you noticed a call for increased environmental action? Are they opening up the call for what needs to happen in order for, for people to, to take care of these communities?
Not Yes and no. Okay, so I think that the climate movement is a little bit, I'd say, very much behind on these other movements, in that the climate movement has this tendency to kind of tokenize a lot of these communities. That is, they kind of speak to, like they're feeling this disproportionate impact. So they kind of talk about the things that I said, but they're they're really not at all involved in these broader struggles that are the day-to-day concerns of a lot of these communities, which of course environmental concerns in parts of those communities are a huge concern, but also what the environmental movement has not been a part of, which I think they should be a part of, is issues over that people are in the streets about now, which is policing and mass incarceration and all these other issues that are more broader systemic issues that people are interested in. The climate movement has not been a part of those. I mean, more radical elements have been part of those discussions, but I think the climate, the mainstream climate movement will say, I think it's still trying to figure out how does it interject itself. So right now it's been very, I would say that it's mostly been curated PR statements and kind of speaking to, we support what's happening and we think what happened with George Floyd is grotesque. But I don't think the climate movement yet has figured out, are we really going to change our position? Are we going to get more involved in these issues, or is it going to just stick to voicing these concerns? So that's all. I think it's all to say that.
But has the Black Lives Matter movement taken on their
Yes.
demand for racial?
I think that if you talk about the other, so outside of like the mainstream climate movement, if you talk about we'll say, Black Lives Matter, or obviously if you talk about, I don't know, want to call it like Native Lives Matter. There's as a hashtag, I don't know if that's a real thing, but like the Idle No More movement, which has turned into Standing Rock. Those are, I think, in Black Lives Matter, they talk about those issues within their movements, but it's very much like from the environmental justice or environmental racism context, which I think is the one that really matters. That's the one that's going to move the ball on these issues and going to get more people involved, is when they see who's really being impacted by these policies. So yeah, I think that they're obviously way ahead of the game in that, in terms of especially the Native community in the United States, but also Black Lives Matter, I know, has part of their policy platform is these issues of environmental justice. So I expect it to be more so going forward, and I think it's going to be community by community. For example, before this, like last year in Philadelphia, the biggest refinery on the East Coast closed down, and that was in predominantly African American or Black community. And there's still discussions in Philadelphia, and I think that it overlaps with the Black Lives Matter movement, which is what's going to happen with this refinery. How are we going to just replace it with something else that's dirty? Is it going to be something that's less polluting of our community? And so I think that those are the kind of things that those are the type of fights that I don't think that like climate groups have really been that involved with, to be honest with you. But those are the ones that are happening, and I think that I'll be interested to see if the climate movement sort of sees this moment as a moment of crisis and sees, oh, maybe we should have been involved in these things. Maybe we need to recalculate the way we do things, or if it's just going to be lip service and then they continue sort of. I think that at the worst level, go back to cap and trade just as a case study of happens all the time. But climate movement, in a lot of ways, the mainstream portions of it can actually be involved in environmental injustice. So like the climate movement in California very much supports cap and trade. Like if you look at the biggest groups like the Sierra Club or the NRDC or the Environmental Defense Fund, they lobbied for and helped get that passed and get the renewal passed in a few years ago when Jerry Brown was still the governor. So yeah, I think I'll be interested to see if this is like, wow, like this is a wake up call for them, or if it's kind of they see this moment just as like a PR crisis moment. I'm not really sure yet. I think it's too early to say, but there's a lot. That's all to say that when we talk about the climate movement in the United States, there's several components of it. Yeah, there's Big Green, there's the environmental justice groups, and yeah, so that's
all of the different Black Lives Matter activists I've had on the program have mentioned the environment as part of the platform, which I'm happy to see. So even if the environmentalists haven't embraced the Black Lives Matter movement, the Black Lives Matter movement have embraced, a clean environment for Black and brown people, which seems like it would go along with Black Lives Mattering, not
absolutely.
just yeah.
I want to say real quick, I just want to go just to the roots of environmentalism before you move on, just because it's been in my head. Like 50, we're also at the 50-year anniversary of Earth Day this year, just happened a couple months ago, and the very first Earth Day, there's a couple noteworthy things about that. So Earth Day was inspired in a lot of ways by the Santa Barbara oil spill in California. And just one noteworthy thing about that, and then I'll talk about my main point. But if you look at who was cleaning up that spill, not only, but a big component of the spill cleanup, and then going kind of looking at what happened in 2010 with the BP oil spill, who was helping clean that up, it was prisoners, and largely black prisoners. So
Oh,
that's not what that part did not inspire Earth Day, the prisoner part of it. But I think that's noteworthy, in that who's cleaning up these spills. Look at the BP oil spill is the same thing. If you go Google that, people who are watching, you can see that there's lots of prisoners who are cleaning up the oil spill for the BP oil spill 10 years ago. But so history repeats itself. But I think the bigger point that I was trying to make is Earth Day was an actual the founder of Earth Day, Gaylord Nelson, who was a senator in Wisconsin. If you look at his address that he gave one day before the first Earth Day, he talked about a lot of these things with environmental justice, and he talked about it's not just like having a pristine environment for white people. It's people. He used it's dated language now, but he talked about people who live in the ghettos who are experiencing these environmental impacts. That's also part of the environment. So that was 50 years ago on Earth Day. I would say that still, like, a lot of these concerns have not been met, and they've been kind of brushed aside, but it was very much a part of the call for the first Earth Day, which was from a Democratic senator at the time. I think it also shows like how the Democratic Party has shifted a little bit rightward, quite a bit rightward since then as well, because
yeah.
you might not hear that quite as much you probably hear a little bit more lip service from Democrats today, but I think that he was a little more serious about it back then. He was also opposed to the Vietnam War. So yeah, things have changed, but I think it's important just to point out that historical point of modern environmentalism was very much based on that kind of paradigm back then, but it's shifted.
Another piece of overlap here that you write about was the militarized response to Standing Rock wasn't just a one-off, as you said, but a model promoted openly by the National Sheriff's Association. In the case of Standing Rock, police and sheriff's units flooded North Dakota from across the country to really violently, quell that protest movement. Can you talk about that and the parallels between what we're seeing today?
Absolutely. So I think that the most striking parallel to me, because I was reporting on this a lot back in 2016 and into 2017 when it was over, just to figure out what had happened. What they did was law enforcement in different states utilized this thing called the Emergency Management Assistance Compact, or EMAC, which had never been used in this way before. It's generally reserved for hurricane relief or natural disaster relief. That's why it was signed into law by President Clinton in the 1990s to respond to those kind of crises. But it exists. It's a tool that they use to say, hey, this is a crisis at Standing Rock, and we're going to flood, we're going to come into the state with, I think it was 6 different states. They had law enforcement, hundreds, if not over 1,000, police officers and sheriffs.
Luckily, we have a Black Lives Matter protest in all of the states. So they're all busy in their own states.
They can't all, yeah, exactly. But I think it goes to that whole point of, we have out-of-state agitators here, right? That's the whole, I think we see that lingo. We saw it in Minneapolis, or, the high-ranking, I forgot who exactly said it, but it was at that press conference where a high-ranking police agent came to that press conference and talked about how most of these people are from out of state. But it's a striking parallel, because if you look at like Standing Rock, for example, it was actually out of state. There's probably people from multiple states who came to Standing Rock in solidarity as well, considering that.
God forbid you think outside of your state lines,
exactly.
and you actually care about your brethren. It's a shock.
Yeah.
For the people who love states' rights and they just think along that lines.
Exactly. But yeah, I mean, I think that it just shows, regardless, I don't think that it's a legitimate argument anyway, but it also shows just the pure disingenuousness of that particular argument. But it also shows look at like the hyper militarized response in Standing Rock. I mean, it's happening even worse now in 2020 than back then. It was already very bad in 2016. So I think it shows that this trend of the militarization of law enforcement as it pertains to protest movements has just gotten more and more severe. And if you look at like, we've been around long enough to know, like, look at what happened at Occupy in 2011. That was very bad too. But I think it's just gotten like increasingly worse and more violent since then in how law enforcement has reacted to these different movements.
I think they were a little softer on Occupy because there was a
Agreed.
lot of white people. It was
Agreed.
mostly white people.
Yeah, I agree.
I do want to say that we're speaking with Steve Horn, climate reporter. You can follow Steve at Steve A. Horn on Twitter. Thank you, A Difficult Truth, for the raid. We're getting an influx of viewers on our stream chat on Twitch right now. Steve, before you came on, we were reading this article in Resilience about how Australia's top climate scientists said we're already in the deep trajectory toward collapse of civilization. And the people in the stream chat would like to know if that is true.
Oh, man.
I scared everyone, and by reading it, and we'd like your thoughts about that.
I saw the headline. I haven't read that yet, but I think that to the extent that it says that we're at least going to the point where large parts of we're trending in this direction very much within several decades, where many swaths of the planet will not be inhabitable because it's the weather impacts of climate change, or just like extreme weather events, or it's just too hot, depending on if you're in sub-Saharan Africa and it's just not inhabitable, or parts of South Asia. I think we're already seeing hints of that today with people who are modern day climate refugees. And if that's what he's arguing, maybe it's in more stark terms. Maybe the way he's saying it is maybe more stark. But if you say it that way, that I think even like mainstream people are saying that's already happening, and will increasingly happen in the decades to come. And I think that if you look at it that way, I don't see necessarily a huge problem with. I know it sounds alarming to hear it, but I mean, we are very far along, and we're just seeing unprecedented different climate science studies that are coming out. I think there was one that just came out last week talking about how the situation in the Arctic is getting worse, like way worse than what was previously thought, and then more ice is melting. So yeah, I think
parallels that he made were basically to the Titanic. If you see an iceberg 3 knots away or 5 knots away, but you're already 3 knots away, it's going to take you those 5 knots to slow down. We really just are out of time in terms of slowing down. I don't think the argument was being made to stop mitigation effort, but this person was talking about not just that the tipping points are being met left and right, and that we're very close. It's not like it's going to tip, that the Arctic sea ice is going to reduce so far in mass in a day that we're all going to notice a giant wave, but we're already there. And so, yeah, this is.
I think it's just not stated that way, but I think he's right. I mean, there's already parts of the world that are becoming more and more inhabitable. I mean, look at the United Nations. They just cloak it in different terms, but like they're talking about losses and damages, and these island states. That's where it comes from. These people who are going to not be able to live where they live anymore because of climate impacts. They're not saying what he's saying in terms of like, they're not saying civilization is sort of coming to a demise. They're not putting it that starkly, but they pretty much are. They're saying like the United Nations, they need to come up with a plan because there's going to be extreme losses and damages, and there needs to be a way to recompensate these people who are going to have to move from where they live because it's becoming uninhabitable. It's happening every year at UN climate summits, and the powerful countries in the world are basically trying to fight against that, because I think that they're worried that like the fossil fuel industry and these big industries will ultimately be held accountable if they admit that they created. Yeah, right. Yeah.
Accountability.
If you
Black people to be accountable for selling loose cigarettes, accountable with their lives, but corporations who are killing civilization, forget it.
Yeah. So agree. Yeah, I think that and we have this year off of the UN climate summit in 2020 because of COVID. So I think that we're just going to see increasing ratcheting up of this discussion of losses and damages from the global south, if you will, in terms of discussing this stuff. But I think that that just goes right to the point, is that that is already happening now. There are already places that are becoming uninhabitable. So I don't think that what he's saying is much of a stretch if you look at the reality of what's actually happening on a yearly or day to day.
Kind of a downer, Steve. It's a downer.
It's a downer, but yeah, I mean, there are. It's why
Hopefully,
I like to say that climate change is in the future. I like the way that Bloomberg, not that everyone loves Bloomberg, Michael Bloomberg, but the news outlet does some good reporting on climate, and they have a section called "Climate Changed." That means it's not that it's in the future. The climate is changed now, and here's that's sort of how they frame it. I sort of like that because it shows that it's not just a future thing. It's very much happening in the
oh, good. I'll check that out. That's interesting. We're speaking with Steve Horn, climate reporter. You can find his work at the Real News Network. Steve, thanks for joining us today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.